As ever, everything is about our interpretation of the legislation and the way the guidance and everything's been published. It was changing on a regular basis up until about November, December, and then it kind of settled down. And I think, ultimately, all the wrinkles that were first in the legislation guidance are now ironed out. So I think we're stating facts rather than our interpretation of things. But it is always, there's an element of interpretation with these things. So bear that in mind. Everything that's written down should be factually accurate, I'm sure. So if we can move on to the next slide. So the agenda, quite a long list of things we want to cover. So we'll look at making work pay, which is what it is. The SSP changes are part of the government's making work pay strategy. There's an awful lot of things that have changed in the HR payroll world. SSP is one of many. Parental leave, national minimum wage, all those type of things. They all come under the heading of making work pay, making sure that employees get a fair reward for their day's endeavours. We'll look briefly at the previous SSP rules, which thankfully are now behind us, but in payroll terms, they aren't quite gone. So we just need to familiarise ourselves with what those were so we can make a valid comparison with what is happening next. We'll then look at the 26-27 changes. So what is changing? The effect of the changes. So having looked at what's changing, what does that mean to us in payroll, to you in your businesses and organisations, and when dealing with your staff on a day-to-day basis? What does this mean for your payroll submission? So very important to us is how information is communicated to us. And part of that is knowing what information is required. Because an awful lot of SSP was invisible, it meant that it perhaps wasn't as important because an awful lot of sickness went under the radar. Now everything is front and center. The way you keep your records, the way they're pushed forward to us becomes more important. Things that remain the same. So these are really the areas that they were very late in the day that were decided what's going to happen, transitionary rules, what's going to happen with linking periods, these type of things. A lot of them have stayed the same in the end because a lot of them weren't considered until people started to delve more deeply. So worked examples of 3 different scenarios, so you can get an appreciation of the factors that we'll consider when calculating SSP. Transitional protections, so they're very important to make sure that, I won't go into too much detail, but when you're moving from one thing to another, it's important that those people who fall between 2 stools are catered for in some way, so they're either not disadvantaged or there's a clear, a clear way of dealing with them. Hidden costs. So I've picked a submission randomly from the myriad submissions that we get, which I thought was quite reflective of the Bureau as a whole. And it had some great examples of things that would change and the impact those changes were going to have. So I pulled that pretty much at random. I did do some analysis of the broader client base to look at that as well. So I'll share that with you too. And then the role of the Fair Work Agency. The Fair Work Agency is a new innovation, a new department which has come into being with effect from this month. It has a very broad remit, the details of which I'll share as far as I can. So next slide, please. So this is the most important slide for me and Bella personally. I shared this in the last few webinars. This is the last time you'll see it. So hallelujah, in the background, I hear you shout, but it's our last chance to get a few final donations to push us a little bit higher in our fundraising. We both completed the London Landmarks Half Marathon on Sunday. We did it in reasonable times, I think, given that I'm 60 plus. So very happy with our performance, apart from the last mile, which was hell on earth. We've had great support from clients. Certainly, a number of clients have given us. We've had support from various people, friends, family, all the rest of it. If any of you are able to make a donation, there is our Just Giving code there. I'll leave it lingering just a moment more so you can take a snap on your mobile phone if you wish to. It's no obligation. But yeah, hey, if we can't ask, we certainly won't get. So thank you very much for at least putting up with me. As I say, this is the last time for this challenge, but who knows? There might be another one down the line. You never do know, do you? Right, we'll move on swiftly from that. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so making work pay. Here's an overview of what making work pay is all about. You do hear a lot of talk of making work pay. ERA, Employment Rights Act, and employment rights reforms. They're all part of the government strategy to make work pay. And it's intended to support people to stay in work and improve living standards, with the aim to put more money in working people's pockets. Excellent news. Boost economic growth and improve conditions for innovation, something we'd all love to do. The Employment Rights Act 2025, a key component of the Make Work Pay plan, brings significant changes to UK employment law, doesn't it ever? One of which is the reform of SSP rules, statutory sick pay, but I'll call it SSP almost predominantly because it's a bit of a mouthful, especially when you're trying to reel off things. So it's reforming the statutory sick pay rules and eligibility criteria. And I think reform is a word I was struggling for at the beginning. I couldn't find it. It's the word that describes what this is all about. The pandemic, we all remember the pandemic, exposed just how precarious work and life is for those on low incomes. It's the government's view that no one should be forced to choose between their health and financial hardship. So these reforms are intended to provide a safety net for those who need it most. So bearing in mind that the SSP, as it currently sits, has been in place since 1983. And at that point, the rate was £27.20 a week. So now it's well over £100. It just goes to show how life has moved on. And in that time, it's hardly changed at all. There was a time in the dim and distant past when employers got reimbursed for SSP, so it wasn't a business cost, which it is now. There was an interim period where very small businesses, it wasn't a business cost, but for everyone else it was. There was a brief period during the pandemic when SSP was reclaimable, but it is not reclaimable. It is a business cost. So anything that is paid through SSP costs you as an organization or business money. And it is still surprising today that people still ask that question, will we get it back? So before we progress further, we've got a poll, and this is, we've got two polls. I'm hoping to remember both of them because they were put in at the last minute, but it's around SSP and contractual sick pay. So we're very aware that a lot of organizations have contractual sick pay in place, which offers more than SSP. We're also aware a lot of organizations don't. So this is just a straightforward question, really, to help us understand whether you, as an organization, offer anything over and above contractual sick pay or occupational sick pay. It has many names. But ultimately, do you do more than the minimum, or do you do the minimum? Or don't you know? Because you may not know. You may be attending as an HR or a finance person who doesn't have responsibility for that area of the business. So if you don't know, that's absolutely fine. We don't know everything. So if you could submit that, it just gives us a picture of what we're dealing with, really. And I'll mention at this point, while you're just completing the poll, that if you have contractual sick pay in place, very often within the contract, there will be a reference to SSP related terms, the most obvious one being waiting days. So with the establishment of the new rules, waiting days will be no more, and there may be a need to consider that part of your contract, because at some point in many years' time, no one will know what a waiting day is or was. And so reference to it may be a dangerous game. So you may need to state what that is. So that's everyone who's answered the poll. So the majority have contractual sick pay above SSP rates, which is great for your employees. A fair number do the SSP rates, and nobody doesn't know. So that's good, isn't it? That's a good start point. We all know what we're doing, which hopefully I can say the same. So thank you very much for that. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide. So the previous SSP rules. So we deal with this day in, day out, and yeah, we're very familiar with the terms, but there are a lot of terms associated with SSP. We love to talk about PIWs and QDs like everyone knows what they are, but of course not everyone does. So here's a brief overview of what it looked like a couple of weeks ago. So in that world, the first 3 days of sickness were known as waiting days. So they were 3 days, the first 3 qualifying days, another term, which were going to be unpaid. So they weren't going to be paid SSP. So the SSP was payable from the 4th day of sickness. So in the 4th qualifying day of sickness, a qualifying day being a normal working day, then sickness would be or SSP would be payable. So first 3 qualifying days, no SSP. Once you move to day 4, then SSP becomes payable. So if an employee had a couple of days off sick, because SSP only considers anything once it has formed a period of incapacity for work, those minor absences, odd days absences, were pretty much invisible, and they had no need to be anything but in terms of payroll. Of course, from an HR perspective, I'm sure everyone was very interested in those odd days, but we had very little interest in them, generally speaking. So SSP was payable from the 4th day of sickness. SSP was only payable if a period of incapacity for work is formed. So that period of incapacity for work is a period of 4 or more qualifying days. A qualifying day is, broadly speaking, a normal working day. So a Monday to Friday worker would be Monday to Friday are qualifying days. Eligibility was assessed using average weekly earnings, which under the old regime had to be above the lower earnings limit. So you were looking at a number of things when you were dealing with a piece of sickness absence. You were looking at the duration. You were looking at what days that individual normally worked, and you were looking at what their earnings were in the 8 weeks preceding the absence, broadly. So that's the way it was. So there's the flowchart beneath. Has the employee been absent for 4 consecutive days? If it's a tick, we're considering it for SSP. If it was a cross, as a payroll department, we had no interest in it whatsoever. As I say, HR may well have had an interest in it. Those with less well-developed HR departments may not have been capturing that information reliably, accurately. That may need to change. Has the employee sat there 3 waiting days? So the 3 waiting days are the first 3 qualifying days for which they won't be paid. And then we start to look at things like linking of periods of absence. So periods within an 8-week timeline can be linked. And the term link is an interesting one because lots of people think it has to be the same type of sickness. So I've got a broken leg, 8 weeks later, I have a gastric ulcer. God, I'm unlucky. Then some people will look at it and say they're not linked, but in SSP terms, they're 2 PIWs and therefore they would be linked. Of course, that doesn't become important anymore. Are the employees' earnings above the LEL? So once you'd established a PIW had been formed and the waiting days had been sat, then we were then looking at the earnings, which were then used to calculate the rate of SSP. The average weekly earnings would establish the rate of pay up to a maximum. So that's the way it was. How is it now? So the changes. Period of incapacity for work under 2025-26 was 4 consecutive days. Now it's 1 day. So if an employee is off, then they have formed a period of incapacity to work. The only caveat to that is that if an employee does turn up for 10 minutes and then goes off sick, that is not a period of incapacity for work. That employee is not eligible for SSP on that day. So they have to be absent from work. If they turn up, then it's it's not eligible for SSP. Earnings eligibility, average weekly earnings above the LEL. Under the new regime, there is no minimum earnings criteria. So effectively, everyone who is absent through sickness will be eligible for SSP, subject to them really being ill, something I might come on to later. And then the rate of pay, the flat rate has changed broadly in line with the percentages of everything else, parental leave and what have you. I haven't actually done the percentage. It looks about 4%, something like that. So the flat rate has increased from 118.75 to £123.25. That's the flat rate. That's the maximum weekly rate that can be paid SSP. So if average weekly earnings are lower, then a lower rate will be payable, 80% of average weekly earnings. So it's the lower figure. A lot of energy was expended when these changes were first talked about. Everyone got hung up on the fact that people were going to take loads of time off because they were going to be on 80% of their pay. And it was never the case. And it was, ultimately there was always a cap on it. It was never going to be, hey, I'm on 60 grand, I'm having a few days off, and I'm going to get my 80%. But it's amazing what people would have you believe. So that's the changes in broad terms. Can I have the next slide, please? The effect of the changes, and in my usual fashion, I've probably given spoilers on some of these. I should have a permanent spoiler alert on my presentations. So low earners, 0 hours and part-time. Individuals who were not previously entitled to receive SSP may now become eligible. They very likely will become eligible. They present their own challenges, shift workers, casual workers, 0 hours workers, because we will still need to establish what is their qualifying day or their normal working pattern. So in some way, there has to be an anchor around which the calculations can be done, because SSP is a weekly rate, is a different rate for depending on the number of days you work, etc. So the record keeping there becomes very important, because previously, hey, that part-time worker who was scheduled for a shift didn't turn up, didn't get paid, invisible to SSP, no PIW formed, everything's fine. Now that individual doesn't turn up. If he's off sick, says he's off sick, then the whole sickness absence procedures would need to kick in, because he may well be, or she may well be eligible for SSP. So there's a whole, it's a bit like holiday pay. The complications around 0 hours, low earners are going to become increased. Short-term sickness, SSP will now be payable for short periods of sickness. So those odd days are going to be, in all likelihood, paid sickness if they're sickness. And again, record keeping, internal procedures, identifying the difference between an unpaid absence and a sickness absence day is going to be important. If it's unpaid absence because they haven't made any representations that they were sick, they just didn't turn up, whatever, then it's unpaid absence, it's unpaid. If it's sickness absence, it's likely to be paid. Previously, we wouldn't have got hung up, and I'm sure perhaps you wouldn't have got hung up about whether it was unpaid absence or sickness absence, a directive would come from the line manager saying Fred was off. Fred was off for the day. It was Saturday. Maybe you had a good night Friday night. Who knows? And that was all you needed to know. You covered off the rota implications and discipliners if they were appropriate or whatever. But you weren't worrying about SSP. Now you might be worrying about SSP. SSP cannot be reclaimed. So I make that point again because SSP cannot be reclaimed. It hasn't been reclaimable for quite some time, with the exception of COVID. It is an employer cost. It's in your interest, everyone's interest, to make sure it's recorded accurately. So your cost, your responsibility to track, monitor, record, deal with in an appropriate fashion. And of course, we as your payroll agent looking after your payroll needs, we need that information too. Absence tracking. Does your absence reporting currently consider sickness periods of less than 4 days? So making the same point again. In terms of information, it's that information thing again. So that's the effect of the changes. So if I could have the next slide, please. What does this mean for your payroll submissions? So payroll submissions are a wonderful thing. They come in all types. We have a vanilla format which we provide to people when they start using our services. Over time that changes. Everyone has a version that works for them, which is fine. They generally work for us too. And if we get the information in a clear and concise way, we're absolutely fine with that. What this does is set in place a requirement for some more information. So in terms of employee sickness absences, we will generally need to know more, and we'll need to know it more often. So in the past, we might have had half a dozen sickness absences on a submission. 3 or 4 of them would have been odd days. We didn't need to know anything about that. We didn't need to know the normal working pattern because it was invisible. It was outside the scope of SSP, not considered in any way. Now, for every absence that you are happy is a sickness absence, we need additional information. Some of you provide this already, so if I'm preaching to the converted, apologies. And you may present it in a slightly different way. That too is absolutely fine. It's the key information that we need. So who is the employee? When did the sickness absence start? And that's a very, very important date. Very often we get to know about a sickness absence some way into the period of absence. So someone was off mid-April, but that period was covered by some occupational sick pay of some description. And so we become aware of it in mid-May when the occupational element runs out and they move on to SSP. For SSP purposes, we are interested in the start date of the actual absence, not when SSP began, because SSP will run concurrently with occupational sick pay. So the clock is ticking for SSP at the same time as occupational. If it's invisible to us, dates won't be right. The 28 weeks that SSP can last for, the end date won't be right. So it is critically important information. And when we ask for the sickness start date, it is the first day the employee was not there. It isn't the first day they were not there and not getting paid under the occupational sick pay policy. Sickness end date, not always known. So the best guess, whatever's on the sick note, what's relevant to that pay period. You make your own judgment calls about how you treat sickness absences that are ongoing. If you have an ongoing sickness absence and it's midway through the month, you've got it certified up to, whether you treat it as sickness absence to the end of the month, and if they come back early, you can balance the payment, or whether you give them the benefit of the doubt, think they're going to be back on whatever, potentially recover it the following month, is entirely up to you. They both have challenges or difficulties associated with them. If you don't deduct it in one period, they often get over deducted in the following period. That can lead to problems. But similarly, if you may not be able to recover it at the end of a period of absence when they decide to leave. So having a clear policy internally on that is the best bet. Number of days absence, and very importantly, the working pattern. So what is the working pattern of that individual? So we've got on there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, because it covers most businesses. If Saturday or Sunday are working days, then include those. If there aren't clearly established working patterns, then as an employer somewhere you should have a policy or an item in your contract of employment that determines, for someone who doesn't have a clear fixed working pattern, what you're going to treat as a qualifying day. I think the legislation is such that if you don't do that, then it's Wednesday. But best to have, I mean, for most people there is clear working patterns, but yeah, not always. And then additional notes for us. So anything else we might need to know. So ideally, that's a document, something similar to that you would submit to us with the payroll submission that will negate the need for us to ask lots of detail about that piece of sickness absence, which, as I say, is now going to become a more regular question than it was, because there's going to be more visible sickness absence. So if you'd like a copy of this sickness record, or I mean, one of the reasons we haven't done anything with it yet is it will, I'm sure, develop over time, over the first few months. It's amazing how, the SSP, when we first looked at it, we thought, yeah, okay, that looks fairly sensible, fairly easy to implement. And then you got to the point where you recognise that lots of things hadn't been considered. They have been considered now, but it develops, it evolves over time. So, but we will certainly make that available to you. So let us know if you would like that. I'm sure at some point, once we're happy it's a final version, we'll upload it to the portal, but we don't want to upload it and then find it's all going to change. Yeah, maybe we'll introduce Saturday and Sunday onto it or whatever. Things that remain the same. Oh, here we go, look. Maybe I should have gone to this one first. So this answers Joe's question. I think this is the one that there was some debate on, but I think we would have put in the correct position, which is that an employee must still have done some work for their employer before they are eligible for SSP. So if you've contracted them to work and they haven't turned up on day one and they turn up on day two, that first day they are not entitled to SSP. So thank you very much, Bella and Lucy, for making sure we'd included that. We've had the conversation in the office a number of times and we were led down the garden path by our chartered body because they told us something different. We said, can't be right. Happily, it wasn't right, but that is right. Employees can still self-certify for the first 7 days of sickness absence. So again, we talked about that a moment or two ago. SSP1 form still to be issued for employees who are not eligible for reasons other than earnings. They're not going to be issued for reason earnings now, because there is no reason earnings because the LEL doesn't apply any longer. But other reasons for not giving SSP, for example, they've had the full 28 weeks, SSP1 is still required. There is still a 28 weeks maximum period for payment of SSP, so that bit didn't change. Linked periods don't change, so absences that are less than 8 weeks or 56 days apart are considered linked. SSP is payable on qualifying days, so it's still payable on qualifying days, so that bit hasn't changed. So now we move on to the next slide. A few worked examples. The first slide, relatively simple. So when we get to calculating the SSP, young man Bob, top man he is, £135 a week. Could be for any reason. He can't be paid that on the national minimum wage, a full-time worker, so he must be part-time of some description. But 80%, and this is a nice example where we know what his weekly wage is. Such joy. So 80% of £135 is £108. Because £108 is less than the flat rate of SSP, SSP will be payable at £108 per week for the duration of his sickness. Charlotte, however, earns £170 per week. So 80% of £170 is £136. Because £136 is more than the flat rate of SSP, SSP is going to be paid at the flat rate. So it's effectively a cap above which SSP won't be paid. So the higher our workers' average weekly earnings, the less affordable a day off becomes. So we move on to another example. So then we get into the realms of slightly more complexity, and our world is all about complexity. If we have a worker, Matt, who works 5 days a week, but his earnings vary depending on the hours he works. So he's some kind of irregular hours worker. If he goes off sick on the 11th of May for 4 days, we are then into the realms of having to carry out calculations. His average weekly earnings in the relevant period. So the relevant period is the 8-week period that precedes the period in which he was absent. And the SSP rate is calculated as follows. So the average weekly earnings in the relevant period is whatever he earned in that period divided by the 8 weeks in that period, which is 138.3275. And we mustn't round it at this point. Heaven forbid we round in the wrong place in payroll. Hopefully our software deals with this type of stuff, but we should still know. 80% of 138.3275 is 109.062. Again, we mustn't round here. Qualifying days per week are 5 days. So his daily rate is going to be calculated as his weekly rate divided by 5 days. So his daily rate becomes 21.8124. Sickness days to be paid are going to be 4. So we multiply the day rate by the 4 days he's going to be paid, which is 87.2496. And then, and only then, can we round it up. So SSP then becomes payable at £87.25 for that period. So day to day, you're not going to worry about this stuff because you've got this thoroughly professional expert outfit down there in Bristol who will do it for you. But having a little bit of understanding of the process is always useful. We have to have an understanding of the process, particularly at times like this when legislation changes, because software changes too. Because I'll let you into a secret, we do use payroll software. It does do some of the heavy lifting for us. But at times like this, when developers have been frantically making changes in last minute attempts to accommodate the latest change in the briefing notes that have been given to them by HMRC, it's important that we're checking to make sure that the logic is giving the right type of answer. So, once you're into it, you've got lots of examples, it's working, is all good. But in these early days, we're all het up on making sure we get the right sickness absence treated in the right way, particularly weeks and months when we're straddling that 6th of April change. So that's that. We'll move on to the next slide. Transitional protections. So transitional protections are there to ensure employees on continuous sick leave before April the 6th do not suffer a reduction in pay when new lower percentage-based rules take effect. So there are a select group of employees who, if we applied the new logic, the new way of working to their sick pay, would see a drop in their daily rate. So the transitional protection makes sure that those employees are not disadvantaged. It's only applying to a select group of workers, those few workers who are straddling that period, but it is there. The transitional protections only apply to continuous periods of sickness. They don't apply to linked periods. So if an employee straddles April 6th, then the situation is different. If there's a linked period, and we've got a couple of slides with examples of what this means to follow. So transitional protection, in this instance, we have an employee who during the week 1st to the 8th of April, which is when the SSP rules change, they have a period of absence of 4 continuous days, where the 4th and 5th are, so they've had their 3 waiting days, and those waiting days fall under the old legislation, or the old SSP rules. So waiting days were still waiting days, and had 2 of those waiting days been on the 4th and 5th of April, they would have been paid as waiting days. But the 3rd waiting day, having moved into the new regime, would have actually been a paid day. So it can get extremely complicated, but as the complications rise, fortunately, the number of people affected shrinks. So there aren't very many people of those, but like we found out in the pandemic, odd scenarios can cause real difficulties. So because the sickness rate is spanning, that is a continuous period of sickness absence, it spans it, takes into account the 2 regimes, then the flat rate will continue to be paid. So we're not going to recalculate average weekly earnings and find it as a lower rate and pay them at a lower amount. However, in the following slide, in this particular case, the period has been interrupted because the employee returned to work on the 5th of April. So because of that, there are 2 separate periods of sickness absence, and as such, that transitional protection doesn't apply. So when they returned, you would calculate their SSP on the lesser of the 26-27 flat rate, or 80%. So we won't come across it very often, but you kind of got to mention it. So next slide. Now we're into, this is my best slide, this one. It might be a bit small to read, but as I say, I took this admittedly, I took it from an employer where I knew there'd be some things that were interesting, but I didn't think it would be interesting all on one slide without me having to fiddle about with it. So just to take you through this, so this is actually a submission that they've made. So I've taken out the non-sickness absence workers, just left their sickness absences. So in this particular case, they've given us information on dates of absence for some of those periods, not for all of them. There's a story behind that, actually. It was a supplementary return that gave us those absence dates, and we haven't put them in because we didn't need them. Of course, we will need them going forward. So the next column, second column, is the number of working days that employee was absent, not absence. The number of paid days, so that was the number of days that were going to be paid under that employer's occupational sickness policy. Then the number of days that were payable under SSP. Other absence we can ignore. I would have took it out if I'd have noticed it. And then the sickness absence is there, it's quantified. Yeah, so we've got a value on it. I didn't actually total that column. I totaled the other ones to make my point now, so it's all good. So the red ones that I've highlighted there, actually I'll spin across and I'll go back to it. So what I've then done is say, what would that have cost me as a business under the old rules, applying the old legislation, and what's it going to cost me under the new rules? So exactly the same periods of sickness absence, assuming they happened in the same month in exactly the same way. What's the difference between the 2? And I worked out that for that particular employer, their sickness absence is going to rise, or the cost of it is going to increase. And I should have put a poll in here because I was going to ask you where you thought there would be higher costs associated with the introduction of this legislation, but I've given you the answers now. So, hey, sorry about that. So what I've done, I've just tallied up what it was going to cost them under old regime, what it's going to cost them under new regime, what's the difference. So in that particular case, for that particular snapshot, there is an increase in the sickness absence, or the increase in the cost to the employer of that absence of 34%. So not an insignificant percentage. 4 from one day to the next. And that was brought about by a number of factors. So firstly, we've got odd days are becoming PIWs. So previously, we're looking at working days. If they were working days absence of 1, 2, or 3 days, we were ignoring them. So effectively, there was nothing to pay. So of the 41 days of absence, we were ignoring 19 of them because there was nothing that needed to be paid. Now those 19 days need to be considered. In addition to that, we've also got dates of absence on the left-hand side. We had someone who was off on the 6th, the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th. So again, that was 4 days of absence. No PIWs were formed. And as a consequence of that, there was no SSP implication. So now there is an SSP implication. So that, it is a consideration. That also affects people who you may be doing phased returns to work. Phased returns to work were quite tricky to negotiate under SSP, if indeed you were going to pay them SSP, because if you phased the return to work so that they worked on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, you would have no SSP liability. However, if you decided to allow them to work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there would be some SSP to pay. So you ended up with phased returns doing the same thing. They're coming back 4 days, and the 5th day, they're continuing to be off absent, potentially being paid differently. Under the new legislation, those phased returns to work will be dealt with in the same way. So that's good. And then we've got the bottom one. They were off from the 9th to the 15th of March. So they were absent for 5 working days. Under the old legislation, only 2 working days would have been paid. Under the new legislation, only 2 SSP days would have been paid. Under the new legislation, 5 days are going to be paid. So that's that. And there's some on company sick pay. Now, there's no effect on them because SSP is always ticking along in the background. We're recording it. It's there. And if it becomes relevant in terms of timelines, then it'll rear its ugly head. But ultimately, it doesn't affect the pay people get. Same with holiday. If you agree with your worker that they're going to take some holiday while they're off sick, then they will be paid their holiday pay rate. But the SSP will continue to tick along in the background. So it doesn't mean they're okay again. It means that SSP is not an additional payment anymore, but in recording terms, it is still there and it's still considered. So I've made the point there, distinction between unpaid absences and certified sickness absence becomes much more important. So I've made the point before and I'll make it again. If they're just off, don't really know why, and they're not going to be paid, now we need to know why, or someone needs to know why, because you don't want to not pay SSP, which is a legal requirement to pay SSP if they're eligible for it. So you need to perhaps be more inquisitive and delve more deeply into those unpaid absences, those AWOLs that we see on timesheets from time to time. So that's that. And I think that's probably pretty near the end. Oh yeah, our good friends, the Fair Work Agency. I gave a spoiler alert at the beginning, as I always do. Fair Work Agency, it's a new UK government executive agency under the Department for Business and Trade, launched in April 2026 to importantly enforce employment rights. So this is about our good friends, the employees, and their rights. It's going to unify existing bodies such as HMRC's minimum wage team, the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority, and the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate. So it's bringing everything together under one roof to look after our good friends, the employees. Scope includes national minimum wage, upcoming webinar on national minimum wage. I alert you to that now. I also alert you to the fact that there will be no mention of London Landmarks half marathons, so you can sleep easy. It's all good. Statutory sick pay, employment agency regulations, modern slavery enforcement, and holiday pay. So a couple of 3 interesting ones there. national minimum wage has always been there. It's previously compliance has been monitored by HMRC, but that will move into the Fair Work Agency. Statutory sick pay, don't know who would have looked at that too closely, because the reality is, if we go back to the times when SSP was recovered, everyone was interested in it and the records kept in association with it, because ultimately you were taking the government's money to support sick workers off through sickness absence. So it was in their interest to make sure that those purse strings were held very tightly. Because SSP has been paid by employers for at least 10, 15 years now, at the end of the day, there's an obligation to make sure the employee gets enough, but it's been fairly kind of low profile, I think. But the Fair Work Agency is going to bring these things back into sharp focus. Anything, there's going to be all the usual kind of grass lines, whatever they call them, hotlines, that you can tell people that you're being underpaid. So there's all these routes in to the Fair Work Agency, who will then have the powers to investigate, look very closely at what's been going on in a business, and look at national minimum wage, which has been done before, statutory sick pay, much more closely monitored, and holiday pay, which is hugely complicated and difficult. And I wish the Fair Work Agency all the luck in the world when they come to do an inspection, compliance visit, investigate further, because they'll have some fun. But they're there. They have the government power behind them. We should be fearful, because they're presumably not going to go away. And everything the government does is focused on workers. Make sure those workers are getting the rewards they deserve for the work they do. And I think we work with employers who are of the same vein. So I don't think anyone sat out there now is knowingly underpaying a worker. We've worked with businesses in the past who we've passed on very quickly, who take a slightly less rigorous view to these things, and might forget holiday pay for somebody who left and God knows what. But we know that you're out there doing things in the right way. Our aim is to try and educate you and help you in achieving those results. We're there to back you. We've got dual responsibility for these things. We look at everything that we can. We alert you to everything that we can. You also need to look closely at what you do, and between us we should make sure that we steer well clear of any choppy waters. But I think that's probably the end, but we'll go to the next slide just to check. So upcoming webinar, national minimum wage compliance webinar. Love a good national minimum wage webinar. It's one of those areas, it is becoming more and more of interest to various people. It is so easy to, without realizing it, fall foul, not because you've done anything underpaying the worker in the broad sense. You're paying them the £10.71 an hour or whatever the rate is, but because of something else that is going on that payroll, be it salary sacrifice, which has obviously been a thing, particularly in pensions, but other things too. Or you may offer yourself your employees a staff purchase facility, which unexpectedly takes them below the national minimum wage. So there's loads of stuff there, which hopefully we can present in a reasonably interesting way. And I would urge you to come along. And as I say, I won't ask you to donate to anything. So it's all good.